Hi, I'm Lowell Gustafson. I'm from the Department of Political Science at Villanova University, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity to speak here with you here at this conference being sponsored by the Communication University of China on the topic of international relations theory and community with a shared future. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to talk to you about what lessons we might be able to discuss regarding one of the founders of international relations theory for some traditions, and what that could mean for us now. The theorist being often credited for being kind of the so-called father of history, along with Herodotus, perhaps, who lived about 2,500 years ago. He lived in ancient Greece and ancient Athens around the 5th century of the before the Common Era, and he writes his history of the Peloponnesian War, a war between Athens and Sparta and their allies, and it's been a very influential book and has really informed people for the last, a lot of people, for the last 2,500 years or so. But of course, there's been a lot of differences on what his main ideas were or what they mean for us. And now, of course, there's a lot of other things that ancient Athens is known for, in addition to the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides. It is well known, of course, for its philosophical tradition. It is the home, or was the home, of the pre-Socratics, of Socrates, of Plato, of Aristotle, and of a whole host of other philosophers and mathematicians and scientists. Ancient Greek philosophy, of course, is very important. It's also often credited as being the birthplace of democracy, that at least some significant portion of the city, albeit the minority, could participate in deliberations, in debates, and settling issues through the use of votes. And so these are a couple of the things, of course, that ancient Athens is very well known for. Now, for Thucydides, his ideas, and he himself has been one of those legacies of ancient Athens, and what he tries to teach about politics, international politics, intercity-state politics, and intra-city-state politics has been important for a long time. He wants to write about what he calls a Great War, which he says was the greatest movement yet known at that point in history. And there had been nothing on such a great scale as what he experienced, with a very long-standing generation plus long war between Athens, Sparta, and its allies. And what he draws from this war, it has had influence for a long time. I mean, many centuries later. In Renaissance Italy, for example, Guerciardini, Machiavelli write about or translate Thucydides' work. Later on in England, in the late 1500s, 1600s, Thomas Hobbes translates Thucydides. When you put them together, Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, and others, that's very often referred to as the so-called realist tradition in international politics, stressing the importance of having very frank discussions about power. And how to organize power, how it's used, and how it should be structured, and what its purposes need to be. The influences of the book that Thucydides writes about the Peloponnesian Wars is used then to interpret other much later events. For example, jumping way ahead to the Napoleonic era. in the early 19th century of Europe. Napoleon was considered to be something of an autocratic military leader of France who led invasions that led to, for a period of time, a very significant European empire. That was threatening to go all the way from modern-day Portugal to Moscow. So he's got a great land power. Now, he did try to have a naval power, but the British did defeat him there, and he got as far as Cairo in Egypt for a period of time. But he's primarily a great land power, and he's something of an autocrat, as opposed to the British, who celebrate their more democratic, their more constitutional system, and they are a great sea power. They rule the waves. So it's a navy versus army. It's a democracy versus autocracy. And in the same way, Athens is considered to be somewhat democratic. It's a naval power. Sparta is a land power, seen as more kind of disciplined and maybe kind of a land military power. And so the Napoleonic era was interpreted by some through this lens. Britain was sort of playing the role of Athens, and Napoleon's forces playing the role of Sparta. Or in the Cold War, over a century later, we have had one of the great stories before the Cold War was the expansion of Russia into something of a land-based empire. And so and then by the time the Cold War rolls around, it incorporates Eastern Europe or the Warsaw Pact. And Joe Stalin is seen as pretty dictatorial, and so here you had a land-based autocratic power, and Stalin had very significant conventional forces. But at least at the beginning, he didn't have nuclear forces, and once he did get nuclear bombs after 1949, his air force was considered inferior, and so he was still primarily a land-based, conventional, autocratic power. So now he was playing the role of Sparta, and the United States, with its democracy and its predominant naval and air force capabilities, able to project power beyond its own territory, played the role of Athens to some degree. So this book by Thucydides just framed a lot of discussions for a long time. Now, just a few years ago, Harvard professor Graham Allison changed some of the role-playing and the meanings of Thucydides, gave a slightly different interpretation and emphasis about what the lesson of Thucydides' book could be for us, and what contemporary yellow flag it's waving that we should pay attention to. This key sentence that he pulls out of what is a very long book that runs for many hundreds of pages, he pulls out this quote: "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable." And so what he's concerned about is if you have an established hegemonic stability, in other words, Sparta is seen as sort of the predominant land power. Now, there is no Spartan empire over all of Greece. There's many different city-states. There's similarities in culture and religion and language and participating in sporting events and so on. But there's nothing similar to what we would associate later on with the Roman Empire, which is administratively connected and having direct military presence, political presence throughout the empire. That's not what we had. But nevertheless, Sparta was traditionally or thought to be seen as the greatest among equals in the city-states. But they are worried about the rise of Athens, that Athens is going to challenge Sparta for its role. This is the situation that Allison wants to focus on. Now, he talks about Thucydides, but he says it's a trap, and it's a trap which nations have fallen into quite a few times. He looks at 16 different cases over the last 500 years where you have an established power, a predominant power, which is challenged by a rising power. And he says that in 12 of these cases, the result was a war. You had sort of a rear-end collision, if you will, and maybe there were specific incidents which led to the war, such as the assassination of the Archduke by an anarchist in Serbia. But while that was the specific spark that set off the First World War, the larger framework was that Britain was the predominant power. It wasn't the head of a united world empire, but it was the head of what was the world's greatest empire and had great influence beyond its empire. So Britain was, in the 19th century, early 20th century, perhaps the world's great power of the time, the superpower, if you will, except Germany was on the rise. And you have the rear end collision between these two. Now, Allison stresses that while this has happened 12 out of 16 times, it did not happen the other 4 times. So he's really not saying that this is a condition which makes war inevitable. But it certainly makes it likely, and it has happened, he says, on a number of occasions. And so he says, I want to wave a yellow flag. He says, we have right now America playing the different role. America's not Athens in this role-playing exercise. It's Sparta. The United States, since the end of the Second World War, or at least since the end of the Cold War, is the hegemonic, the source of hegemonic stability. But that what we've seen in the last few decades is very distinctly the rise of China. So he says, let's keep an eye out. Maybe we have some specific flashpoints. We've got arguments about the Uyghurs, or about the role of what we refer to as Taiwan, or Hong Kong, or the South China Seas. All of these are issues about which the United States and China have disagreed. But those are the specific flashpoints. And what he's warning us about is don't let them cause us to stumble into a war. Don't let us get caught in what he sees as the Thucydides trap. And this is the gist of what he's arguing for in his book. And it's attracted a lot of attention in the United States, with a lot of approving comments from various political figures, senators and generals and heads of the National Security Council, Henry Kissinger, who's kind of the eminence Greece of American foreign policy, the wise old man now for decades, says that the book points to a crucial part of contemporary international relations. And it seems to this concern with the rise of China, those worry about the rise of China, has been expressed by our current president as well, Joe Biden. He says that we're at an inflection point between those who argue that autocracy is the best way forward, and he wants to link a little bit the single-party system headed by president who seems to be there for life as being an autocracy, who traditionally would have played the role of Sparta in this interpretation, and those who understand that democracy is essential, Biden says. So, in the old terms, this would have made us the Athenians, and we could have had China be playing the Spartan role. And then he tells reporters, on my watch, China will not achieve its goal to become the leading country in the world. It's trying to become the source of hegemonic stability, or the wealthiest country, the most powerful country in the world. Instead, he wants to emphasize that no, it's the democracies that can still function in the 21st century. Democracies understood as competitive party systems with regular elections and most likely somewhat regular changes in who's holding the highest officers. And then he tells David Brooks of the New York Times, we're kind of at the place where the rest of the world is beginning to look to China, and that worries him. This is the rise of China, and of course Joe Biden said that we would be willing to defend Taiwan if there was some condition where China decided to attack it. Now, his advisors walked that back because that hasn't been the policy of the United States, but it's exactly that sort of flashpoint that Allison is warning us about in Destined for War in his book. Now, I would like to argue that I think Allison is making a point that's worth looking at, but I think that by whittling this hundreds of page book down to one sentence, oversimplifies it and maybe gets us to miss a point about what Thucydides is trying to teach us, and which merits our attention as we go forward. So let's just go back for a few minutes and just kind of go over some of the main points of Thucydides' Peloponnesian Wars. He begins his book talking about the kind of archaic conditions of ancient Greece, which are somewhat comparable to what the contemporary physical anthropologists talk about, the prehistory of Europe for the last number of thousand years. And that is that we have a number of different tribes or ethnic groups living in these areas, that there is no overarching political structure among them. There is no, it's not an empire. And Greece will not be. The Hellenic Peninsula is not an empire throughout Thucydides' period. So we begin in a situation of pluralism with a number of different autonomous, independent groups. And they value their equal participation in the life. They start to forge cultural unities. They start to develop similar languages and values and religious systems and sporting facilities. And so when they are threatened by an external empire, which happens to be the Persians, who seek to incorporate ancient Greece into its empire, the different independent city-states of Greece come together and they repel the Persian invasion. And so that's the next step that Thucydides looks at. You start with that pluralistic tribal condition, then you go into a pluralistic city-state condition in the Hellenic Peninsula, and you have their successful defense of their freedom against an imperial threat coming from the outside. Later on, Pericles, one of the famous generals in Athens, gives a famous oration oration, a funeral oration, in which he makes a number of interesting points, but one of them is based on this tradition. He says that happiness depends on being free. This is the source of the famous liberal tradition, liberal in its classical sense. In English, having the same root word as liberty or freedom. To be a liberal is to care about living a free life, free of an imperial control, free of dominance of one over the others, participation of a great many groups in society, that you have a more pluralistic, more individualistic even, a polity that Thucydides seems to emulate. But now Thucydides is an Athenian. And he says, this is where we've come from. This is what we've been a part of. And Thucydides is a patriot. He cares about Athens, but he's worried about what I think he sees as a deterioration, as a corruption, of a perversion of traditional Athenian values or Hellenic values, which, among others, to be great means to be free and to value a system in which other players are free to be great. Instead, the regime type, the way that Athens organizes itself and its relations with others begins to deteriorate. And this, I think, is what Thucydides is worried about, and explains then the style in which Athens seeks to rise and become a great. For one thing, it starts to develop its navy. And it's interested in projecting power and the accumulation of wealth through trade beyond its borders for the purpose of starting to build an empire. This might be a little bit analogous. Kaiser Wilhelm read the famous book by Alfred Thean about the influence of sea power upon history, and he said that he needs to develop his navy to challenge Britain's navy. The Athenians are not challenging anyone's navy. They are going to become their own great naval power and outflank Sparta's land-based military power. All right, so that sort of creates the anxiety. And insofar as that goes, I think that Allison is right. It's just that now the purpose of Athens' military capabilities has started to change. In the war against the Persian Empire, the purpose was to maintain the freedom, the independence of a number of different Greek city-states. Now it's for the purpose of gaining increased wealth that can be used to finance naval power, which can be used to start to form more structured systems of dominance over other city-states. So that's the kind of the context for this. And then you have the tensions between the different groups in all cities. Thucydides talks much about the Democrats and the oligarchs, the party of the few and the many. The Democratic Party is the party of the many, the oligarchs of the few. And that you have the elites and the common peoples, the snobs and the slobs, in one crude way of expressing it. But you have this pluralistic situation in many different cities. And in one of them, Epidamnus, the Democratic Party drives out the oligarch party. Now, this is a problem. This is where the many, the populists, rise up and force out the elitists, the few, instead of living in tension with them, and that there's a wisdom in living in a more pluralistic setting. So the oligarchs do what losers in situations often do. They go looking for support from the outside. And the Epidemnus oligarchical party goes for its for support from its neighbors. And this is done in the context of Athens being seen not just by Sparta, but by people throughout um, ancient Greece as trying to increase its power. And so the oligarchs are saying, now we have to worry about this city that's claiming to be democratic, but also imperialistic. And those of us from this tradition need to form an alliance, not only to protect those of us who are from the city of Epidemnus, but city-states throughout Greece. And it's not just this one power that's concerned about that. The Corinthians notice this as well. They say Athens has deprived some states of their freedom. They've noticed what the Athenians are starting to do with their naval power. And they say, and the Athenians are scheming to do the same things for others, especially among our allies, and that she herself has for a long time been preparing for this eventuality of war. So the Corinthians are just one among the cities which has noticed that Athens is starting to become a dominant power, is thinking not so much about pluralistic order within the peninsula, but about hegemony in the peninsula, and this is what's worrying it. As the Athenians start to use their force against other Greek states, not with other Greek states to repel foreign empires, but for itself to have starting to become an empire and use its force against fellow Greek states. One of their victims becomes the island of Melos, and before the battle, there's a dialogue. The famous Malian Dialogue between Athenian representatives and the Malian representatives. And this goes on for a few pages. By the way, these are the few. Now, Allison just quotes one sentence. Traditionally, anthologies and international relations will take out these few pages. At least it's better than a sentence. But they take out these pages of the Malian Dialogue and say, this is what Thucydides' lesson is. This is Thucydides' theory of politics, of international politics, of intra-city-state politics. That this is, if you read these few pages, you know what Thucydides is trying to tell us. And he's just telling us to accept the hard facts, but the real, the reality of politics, which is, as the Athenians tell the Malians, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That politics is about power, and it's unrestricted power, and power is about domination and hegemony. And the Athenians seek a hegemonic order. The Malians respond saying, well, we want to speak about what is fair and what is right. Like Plato, they will argue that politics is not primarily about power. It's about justice. It's about what is right, what is fair. And they appeal to religion. They say that we trust that the gods may grant us fortune as good as yours, since we are just men fighting against unjust men. So there's these two great views about, is politics about justice? Is it about power? And the Malians and the Athenians line up on different sides of that issue. But the Athenians warn the Malians. They say, you've got to calculate the realities here. You're engaged in wishful thinking. Look at how many resources you have. They are scanty as compared with those arrayed against you. Your hope in the gods and your sort of single-minded concern with justice and fairness and rightness is blinding your judgment, and that's what is ultimately fatal to so many people. And the Malians respond, no, we put our trust in the fortunes by which the gods have preserved it until now, and in the help of men, that others, they hope, will come to the defense of the aggrieved and almost defenseless city. And so that's how the dialogue ends. And the Athenians say, you have made your decision. We tried to talk you out of it. It's a bad decision that you've made, and it will have consequences. And it does. There's a battle between the Athenians and the Malians, and the Athenians have a complete and unconditional victory. And then what was the result? The Malians surrendered at discretion to the Athenians, who put to death all the grown men whom they took, and sold the women and children for slaves, and subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the place themselves. It's an utter defeat for Milos. The men are killed, the women and the children are enslaved. And so what do we learn from this? Power politics is what it's about. And the Athenians won the battle. You can't argue with success. And that what we need to learn from this is that politics is not a struggle between power and justice. Politics is about a struggle between greater power and lesser power, and you need to calculate power very carefully, and just make sure that you don't challenge the dominant power too early, but that when it becomes possible to knock the greater power off their throne, and then to replace them with with yourself becoming the greater power. That's the lesson that Thucydides has for us, and that's what we need to be doing in the future. This is in fact how a lot of Western history has often been referred to. For example, the idea of peace and stability coming from a predominant power, the hegemonic stability, depends on there being a dominant power which can, defeat any takers. And so we have the idea of the Pax Romana, that the Roman peace depended on the discipline of Rome's armies, which defeated all in their way, and that this provided great wealth and stability throughout the Roman Empire, and it lasted for a long time, and so a number of centuries later, we refer to the Pax Britannica. In the 19th century, Britain, it didn't have a world empire in the sense of being in control of every country in the world, but its colonies were spread around the world. Of course, for a period of time, it included the eastern seaboard of the United States. It includes what is most of modern-day Canada, India, South Africa, Australia, and it could just as well, in a more informal sense, include a good deal of South America with its preferential commercial trade agreements and kind of its indebtedness. These South American regimes owed a lot of money to the city of London, and that was a mechanism through which Britain exercised its economic influence there. And of course, we have the British influence in China. We have the Opium Wars, in which Britain and other European and the Japanese as well all exercised great influence in China. So the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, was a time of being an inferior power in China, and great lessons were learned because of all of that. Now some talk about a Pax Americana. We've had the decline of the British Empire, but then the rise of the American Empire. There are different counts of how we count military bases, but we've got some hundreds of U.S. military bases spread around much of the world, not in every country by any stretch of the imagination, but in a lot of countries, in Europe, in the Middle East, in the Pacific nations, in Latin America, and that the United States, what considered itself to be one of the two superpowers in the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War, date that as you will, 89, 91, the world had a unipolar system rather than a bipolar system. We have a dominant American system. That globalization and Americanization seem to have gotten connected for many people. And this is what provides stability in the world order. That real peaceful world order depends on this. There are other powers, no doubt, but none to challenge the United States, and that's indicated by our defense spending. We spend more on defense than the next 11 countries combined, although it's an interesting euphemism. Is this defense spending? Is it offense spending? Either way, it's military spending, that the United States spends an incredible amount of money on its military, on its bases, on its military presence, on maintaining a global hegemonic stability. There may be other powers that are thinking about challenging it, but so far they are being very cautious and they are biding their time. Now, there's quite a few people who are saying, look, we're overstretching ourselves. This is unsustainable. We don't have the capabilities to do what we're doing right now, and it's going to break down. It's not going to last. Every other empire has collapsed. The Romans have collapsed. The British have collapsed. A lot of other empires have collapsed, and the American empire will be no exception. And one of the reasons will be exactly this military spending. Now, there's other things that we spend money on. We spend money on entitlements, on all kinds of beneficial social programs. We have to pay the interest on our debt. So military spending isn't the only thing that we have to spend money on, but it's a significant portion of the annual budget of the United States. And the bottom line is we can't pay for it, and we're not paying for it. Instead of paying for it through taxes, we're borrowing money to pay for all of these things that we want to do. And so we've had this significant increase in our national public debt over the years. Right now, it's up to very close to $29 trillion. And in terms of, in absolute terms, that's an awful lot. And relative to our gross domestic product, it's in excess of the value of our production each year. And so there are people who say, look, there's yellow flags waving, that the American values have changed, that it seems as though we started off celebrating the notions of freedom, of liberty, and too increasingly, we've become a militarized state which is interested in having at least influence, if not celebrating being at the pinnacle of a unipolar system. This is a warning. I think this is the yellow flag that Thucydides is waving. The primary concern of Thucydides is not just the fear among the Spartans due to the rise of Athens. It's a fear about how Athens has changed itself and what its purposes are, what it's trying to achieve, and what's going to happen to Athens as a result of these deteriorations. This is why it's unfortunate that anthologies only include the Malian Dialogue, because if you would read the next chapter immediately after the Malian Dialogue, it's the book which talks about the decision by the Athenians to begin a second war. A war in Sicily. They haven't settled the war against Sparta, but they've gotten, the taste for dominance. They've gained some success, and it's a lot of fun to exercise power. And so the same winter, immediately after they defeat Milos, they start to think that, yes, we can become the hegemonic, all-powerful state, and they resolve to sail to Sicily, even though most of them were ignorant of the size and number of inhabitants in Sicily, that they were undertaking a war not much inferior to that against others in the Peloponnesian Peninsula. They seemed to be quite oblivious to what they were doing. They had become blinded, and they had been entrapped by the love of increased power. Not all of them had. A general. They did have the deliberation in Athens before deciding to invade Sicily. There was a debate, and one of their generals, an esteemed person that clearly Thucydides admires and respects, is Niceus. And Niceus speaks in opposition to invading Sicily. He says this is no time for running risks or grasping at a new empire before we have secured the one we have already. He says even if many Sicilians could be conquered, they couldn't be controlled over the long run. And he reminds his fellow Athenians that success comes from foresight, clear-eyed foresight, and not much is even granted simply by wishing for it. The Athenians had accused the Malians of wishful thinking by depending on the gods to enforce the principles of justice and fairness. Niceus is saying you Athenians have become, have fallen into the trap of wishful thinking because you have been ensnared by the love of power, which is causing you to think beyond your real capabilities. He's asking for a more clear-eyed assessment of this. Now, there's another speaker in the debate, Alcibiades. He very much argues in favor of the invasion of Sicily, but his argument is very odd. In his speech, he talks about horse breeding and about the wealth that he has. He doesn't make an analysis of Athens' power relative to that of Sicily at a time when it's already at war against Sparta. He tells the Athenians that they should go to war and that he should lead the expedition against Sicily. Why? Because after all, he entered 7 chariots at the Olympic Games and he took first, second, and fourth place. You can see Thucydides throwing up his hands in despair when that's the argument that wins the day. And the Athenians cheer him and vote in favor of going to war. And so off to the second war they go. And it's, as Niceus predicted, it's a disaster. Now, Thucydides says this was the greatest Hellenic action that took place during this war. And in my opinion, Thucydides says, the greatest action that we know of in Hellenic history. To the victors, the most brilliant of successes. To the vanquished, the most calamitous of defeats, for they were utterly and entirely defeated. Their sufferings were on an enormous scale. Their losses were, as they say, total. Army, navy, everything was destroyed, and out of many only a few returned. So ended the events in Sicily. And who was the vanquished power? Who was the power that lost utterly? It was the Athenians. The Athenians are decimated in Sicily. Niceus, who argued against the invasion of Sicily, did agree eventually to become its leader. He's killed in the war, and Thucydides laments that he's killed. He says that he of all people did not deserve to die from in this war, but he and so many others did as well. And the Athenians overstep, they overstretch, they search for hegemonic stability, or at least for hegemony, for dominance, and they are decimated, and increasingly now everyone in Hellas and ancient Greece sees this, and they turn against the Athenians. That's the outcome of Milos. The Malian story doesn't end with the Athenian victory against the Milos. It ends with the Athenian devastation in Sicily, and then it got worse. To make matters worse, the Athenians then lose another battle. And Thucydides reports, when the news of what had happened in Euboea came to Athens, it caused the very greatest panic that had ever been known there. Not the disaster in Sicily, though it had seemed great enough at the time, nor any other had ever had so terrifying an effect. And indeed, there was every reason for despondency. The army at Samos was in revolt. They had no more ships, no more crews for ships. There was civil disturbance among themselves. No one could tell when it might come to actual fighting. Athens had collapsed. The Athenians were at each other's throats. They had no more military capabilities. They had reached for dominance, and they were now going to be humiliated, and so we come to almost the end of the Peloponnesian War, which has gone throughout most of Thucydides' life. He is an Athenian lamenting what has happened to his city. He himself is despondent over this. The end of the book seems to be a little bit choppy in its writing. It's coming towards the end of Thucydides' life. The conditions are certainly chaotic. That might explain it. But it does seem as though there's something of a redemption story here. After this disaster that the Athenians have brought on themselves through the perversion of their values, they seem to have recovered a little bit of the original values that they had. And that's what enabled them to begin to recover their greatness. Thucydides reports that the 5,000 Democrats deposed the oligarchs, a constitution was drawn up, and the Athenians appear to have had a better government than ever before, at least in my time, Thucydides writes. There was a reasonable and moderate blending of the few and the many, and it was this, in the first place, that made it possible for the city to recover from the bad state into which her affairs had fallen. Athens itself is going to accept pluralism within its regime. And it's no longer, as a result, going to continue the madness of trying to become the single dominant power over all of their fellow city-states. And it seems as though Athens, there is hope for Athens now for its future. All right, so so what do we could take? What can we take from what I think is the Thucydides, the teaching on this, or the lessons from this? I'm going to argue that his real argument is we need a more pluralistic regime within the cities and between cities. For us, within nations and between nations, we need a reasonable and moderate blending of the few and the many as we consider our future greatness. To have the struggle for one power to be dominant over the other is going to lead in the long run to the collapse of maybe all of them. In any case, what do we see as some hope on the horizon in our own time? The United States and China just declared a joint declaration on cooperating for climate action in the 2020s. We have a shared planetary future. We are all part of the same planet. Climate change does not respect national borders, and so that's something, and that's within what I think is what the lessons of Thucydides is trying to teach us. We, the Chinese, the Americans, the Indians, the Europeans, the South Americans, the Africans, everyone, we face a common threat. There is no global empire. Even the United States doesn't have unquestioned hegemony over all of its allies, not even close. The common threat in any long run, even if you're just thinking about the end of our century, it doesn't come from the Persians, it doesn't come from the United States or from China or from anywhere else. It comes from climate change, for some people anyway, and that the United States and China and other powers need to participate in a multi-power battle against carbon dioxide and methane. That we must all affirm our commitment to the freedom of all nations, exercise self-limits, not search for hegemonic stability. Look to achieve something that the Europeans achieved for a period of time, at least partially, after the Napoleonic Wars, after the Congress of Vienna of 1815. They had a world restored, as Henry Kissinger called it, in which there were a number of great powers. There were the Austro-Hungarians, and there were the Prussians, or the Germans, there were the French, there were the British. You had a so-called concert of Europe. Now, the playing wasn't always in harmony. You had the Crimean War. It wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. You had other conflicts among these great powers, but there was no Napoleonic scale continental war such as what we had at the beginning of the 19th century. So you had something referred to sometimes as the concert of Europe. It lasted decently well for a century until 1914, when it broke down and we had two great world wars. We at our time are trying to achieve something quite different. We are trying to say that we don't want to interpret what's going on now as China threatening the dominant position and has to be beaten back, as if the choice is between a Chinese hegemonic stability, an American hegemonic stability, or some other power's hegemonic stability. If that's the way it works out, it's not going to turn out for any of us, perhaps. Instead, we need a pluralistic order, one in which blends the few and the many. We have the few great powers. Exactly who they are, we can decide on our own. We have obviously the United States and China, we've got Russia, we've got India, we've got Brazil, we've got France and Britain and Germany. You can put in whatever other countries you want to see as among the few, as among the oligarchs, as the great powers. But we also have the many, and the many are not to be discounted. Perhaps they are, by military and economic measures, a little less powerful. But they are to be included in significant ways. We need a pluralistic world order with all of them, in which we consider our common future, and a future which is sustainable, which does not bankrupt us, and which does not lead us to stumble into a war. And so we all need to think. We need to reflect on the best ways that our policies regarding any number of potential flashpoints, those specific disputes which could unintentionally draw us into conflict that is significant at some point. We need to reflect on that so that we don't let that happen, but more importantly, we need to rethink what produces the structure of stability. And it's not a search for hegemony, I think, is the lesson that Thucydides is making us see. So we need to, take I think the words of Xi Jinping to heart. He says we all need to work together to avoid the Thucydides trap, destructive tensions between an emerging power and established powers. And here the idea is that we should not see international relations as necessarily about a struggle for a single hegemonic power, which is going to probably be beyond any of our grasp, at least in any long run. We need instead a pluralistic system, a pluralistic world order stability, which enables all nations, or at least as many nations as possible, to achieve their greatness through their own freedom to develop in ways that are consistent with their values. We need this type of dialogue that is being hosted today by the Communication University of China, a dialogue in which we first listen to each other for the sake of learning, and only then for the sake of responding and contributing what lessons we have each learned from our own traditions. And we seek for an international relations theory that can guide our leaders so that out of this dialogue, we can contribute to the nurturing of a pluralistic international community with many members who all share a common future. Thank you.